This is the Haunted Mansion in Disneyland, an attraction with one of the richest and most complicated histories of any attraction at any Disneyland park. And in this episode of Fresh Baked Disney, we're going to bring to you its complete history and secrets. It is thought by some that the Haunted Mansion is one of the original attractions of Disneyland, and while its history does go back quite a ways, it didn't open in Disneyland until 1969, 14 years after opening day. The story of the Haunted Mansion begins in 1951 with the original concept drawing commissioned by Walt for the building of a park across the street from the studios. Fast forward to 1957 when Walt decided to expand Disneyland with the creation of New Orleans Square. Walt asked Ken Anderson, an animator and writer at the studio, to help flesh out some story ideas and artwork for the proposed attraction. The initial design of the mansion was inspired by the Evergreen House in Baltimore, Maryland. Later, additional inspiration was drawn from the Winchester Mansion in San Jose, California. The Winchester Mansion was a home owned by the widow of the gun magnate William Winchester. This house is pretty crazy. The widow Sarah was told that in order to prevent evil spirits from invading her home, it must never stop being built. And so she did, with construction of an ultimately bizarre home that defied logic or reason. The first draft of a story for the mansion was centered on a pirate captain by the name of Gideon Gorlou. He was given the nickname Captain Gore by his crew as an obvious play on his name, as well as due to his notorious reputation. Captain Gore was married to a woman named Priscilla, and they lived together in the mansion. And at some point, Priscilla finds herself in the attic of the mansion where she finds a trunk full of pirate stuff and learns that her husband is actually a notorious pirate. Captain Gore learns that his bride has found out a secret and promptly kills her for it. There are varying stories describing how she was killed, with some having her thrown into a well, while others have her being thrown out of a window. Most favor the window story for the final draft, as the bride is standing near a window in the attic. So Captain Gore, feeling guilty over killing his bride and haunted by her spirit, decides to take his own life by hanging himself in the rafters. It's pretty easy to see that scene still alive today in the stretching room, and is perhaps the single most famous scene in the attraction. Another story idea, similar to that of the Winchester house, was of a mansion that was never finished. Concepts for the story included a worker who cemented himself into a wall. This image also survives today in the graveyard scene, where you can find a hand with a cement trowel in it behind a wall of bricks cementing itself in. While development of a story was in progress, construction of the mansion facade began in 1961 and completed in 1963. The initial plans for its design were to create a dreary, run-down mansion. But Walt had declared then that he didn't want a beat-up mansion detracting from the pristine beauty of the rest of Disneyland. It was then that he famously said, "We'll take care of the outside and let the ghosts take care of the inside." In other words, dreary and spooky are great, but only once the guests are inside the mansion. With construction complete on the mansion facade, but with the ride itself still in development, this sign was posted on the gates surrounding the mansion. The sign stated that post-lifetime leases were now available with the Ghost Relations Department. The idea here is that the Haunted Mansion was to be a rest home for ghosts. At the time, the sign had no connection at all with the current stories being developed, but it would wind up being quite helpful many years later. It was right around this time that development of the attraction was put on hold so that Walt and his team of Imagineers could focus on their commitments to the upcoming World's Fair in New York. Once the World's Fair ended, work started up again, this time with Raleigh Crump working on designing gags and scenes for the Haunted Mansion. Raleigh is a Disney legend who was a key figure in the development of It's a Small World and the Tiki Room. So when Walt first saw what Raleigh had created, he was unsure how it would work. Raleigh's designs were quite strange. Raleigh's designs included a gypsy wagon, talking furniture, floating chandeliers, and some others you might recognize today, like marble busts that followed guests and family paintings that changed before your eyes. This was the beginning of a short-lived idea Walt called the Museum of the Weird. By now it had already been 7 years since work began and 4 years since the Haunted Mansion itself was built. Yeah, the Haunted Mansion was teasing guests with a promised attraction for 4 years and would continue to do so for another 5 years. Part of this extended delay was due to Walt's passing in 1965. At the time of his passing, Claude Coates and Mark Davis were working on the Haunted Mansion story. And because Walt had always had a final say on all projects, the direction of the Haunted Mansion was kind of in limbo. There were two distinct camps. The Claude Coates camp wanted a serious, spooky mansion, while the Mark Davis camp wanted a funnier, gag-filled attraction. Eventually, the Mark Davis camp won out, and the key feeling throughout the attraction is one of humor. But some of the scare scenes can certainly still be found. While Davis's presence can be seen in the first half of the show, it primarily belongs to Coates. There are no characters at all, only the suggestion of spooks and noises coming from behind closed doors and other haunted spirits begging to get out. The seance scene with Madame Leota acts as a sort of segue to the Mark Davis portion of the attraction, beginning with the Grand Hall. And so in 1969, with the story in place and all the gags and effects ready for the public, the Haunted Mansion opened its doors on August 9th. That's 6 years after the actual mansion was built, 11 years after initial designs and concepts were drawn up, and 18 years after Walt's first idea for a haunted house. So we're just getting started on this complete history and secrets of the Haunted Mansion, and to continue, I think it's best to go back to the front. The mansion looks today just as it did when it opened in 1969. The only real changes that have been made are to the grounds around the mansion. If you're not here during the holidays, you may not know that the Haunted Mansion actually has a fast pass. It's in use though only during the Nightmare Before Christmas overlay season. Now there's an urban legend going around that this hearse was the very one used to transport the body of Brigham Young. Is it true? Not at least according to Disney and BYU. So the story goes something like this. The hearse was actually purchased in the 90s with the purpose of being used for an Indiana Jones stunt show. That show never happened, but they still had a hearse and they needed to find a use for it. It was Disney legend Tony Baxter that suggested they put the empty collar at the front of the hearse to make it look like there was an invisible horse pulling it. And it turns out the effect was so well received, it's been reproduced at other Disney parks. Now when the park is busy, this area fills up with guests, and you are given an opportunity to see the infamous pet cemetery. These are tombstones all for lost pets with clever epitaphs filled with puns and that kind of thing. The pet cemetery is fairly new to the exterior queue, but there has almost always been one. A production designer started one on the side of the mansion in an area unseen by guests. As far as I know, the only way to see it is to use an emergency exit that's located in an area right where you board the doom buggies. Moving inside, guests meet in the infamous stretching room. This is where we first meet the ghost host. There were quite a few ideas on how the attraction should be hosted. Those included using Captain Gore's butler, Walt Disney himself, and a raven. Actually, the ravens are still here. There's at least 4 throughout the ride, and if you can't see them, you should be able to at least hear them. There's one over the coffin in the conservatory. There's one on Madame Leota's chair. There's one while filing out of the attic and down into the graveyard scene. And there's one over the doorway into the tomb before you meet the hitchhiking ghosts. They finally decided, though, against using a physical character to host the attraction. Instead, they went with a disembodied ghost voice, which I can only assume has to be Captain Gore. This decision, by the way, to go with a narrator as opposed to an actual person or character was done in conjunction with the decision to move from a walkthrough to a ride-through. That's right, at one point it was planned that guests would walk through the mansion and watch all the gags and props at their own pace. This changed, though, with the invention of the Omnimover, which we'll discuss a little later. Okay, so the stretching room stretches not because it's cool, but because Imagineers needed to get your body underground. So rather than put you in a regular old elevator, they created this wonderful illusion. Look how cool those gargoyles look. Gotta love Disney detail. The effect of Captain Gore hanging himself from the rafters in the attic is achieved through the use of a scrim. This is a traditional theater device where the fabric used both reflects and transmits light. This means that when lit only from your side of the fabric, it looks solid, in this case a ceiling, but when lit only from behind, like when the lights go out in the elevator, it becomes translucent, which is totally awesome. So why do they need you to get underground? Well, because this is a giant attraction that requires a lot of space, way more than you can fit inside that mansion. So they had to build a giant studio on the other side of the train track, and that's what those green buildings are you see when you ride around the monorail. But like I said, in order to get into that building, you have to go under the Disneyland Railroad. And that's what you're doing when you're walking through the Hall of Paintings. You're actually walking under the berm that marks the perimeter of the park and onto the stage across the way. The paintings in the Hall of Paintings are actually a Raleigh Crump creation. They work today in a similar way as the scrim does in the stretching room. The images change in concert with the flashes of lightning. The 2 busts at the end of the hall, also from Raleigh Crump, are a simple effect. They're not busts at all, but rather negative impressions in the wall. Because of this, your eyes and the light around the objects react differently, which makes it look like their eyes are following you. Now's a good time to talk about them doom buggies. Wait, hold on, not yet. Remember all those design delays we talked about earlier? Well, it took 10 years to figure out how to tell this story. And those delays wound up working in their favor in that the Omnimover was developed in that time. The Omnimover was first used in the Adventures Through Inner Space attraction in Tomorrowland. You know, the one that shrinks you through the wonders of magnification. Yeah, so if they had been on time with the Haunted Mansion, it might have wound up a walkthrough, or possibly a water ride like Pirates. But because they had the Omnimover, they could easily scrap the walkthrough idea. They were then able to create a much more focused experience with higher guest capacity. The Omnimover also allowed the use of onboard audio, making the ghost host narrator a possibility. There are around 130 doom buggies working at any one time. With an average of 2 guests per car, that's about 250. Or around 2,500 per hour. By comparison, Space Mountain can do just about 1,000 per hour. The endless hallway with the floating candelabra effect is achieved by using mirrors on the left and right walls behind the candelabra, creating an infinite reflection of itself. At one point, that suit of armor was the real thing. A cast member would put the suit on and try to scare guests as they went through the attraction. This didn't last long though, because a few guests got a little frightened and I think they tried to attack some of the cast members. The corridor of doors was inspired by Robert Wise's The Hunting. The grandfather clock has 13 hours, spins backward, and is some kind of demon. Teeth surround the clock face, and there are eyes set above that, and the clock's pendulum is actually some kind of pitchfork tongue. The effect of Madame Leota's face in the crystal ball is not a hologram, but rather a very practical effect. It's a physical head in a glass ball, but with limited facial features, and a speaking Leota is then projected onto the face. The crystal ball didn't start floating in the air until 2006. Madame Leota is voiced by Eleanor Audley. She also provides the voice for Lady Tremaine in Cinderella and Maleficent from Sleeping Beauty. And that, I think, is a really cool piece of trivia. Share that with your friends. Now, the face of Madame Leota belongs to Leota Toombs, a production designer for Disney. This is a good one. Okay, there's no floor between your Doom Buggy and the stage where Madame Leota is. Imagine a donut, but the stage is the donut hole and the actual donut is empty space. Your Doom Buggy goes around the donut of empty space. And this is where we enter the Grand Hall and where the show transforms from a serious spooky mansion to a more lighthearted one. The method used for creating the ghostly dancers and diners in the Grand Hall is called the Pepper's Ghost effect. And it's a pretty simple effect that requires only a sheet of glass and some practical models. The ghosts are on a stage behind and above the ride track with light hitting it. Glass above these dancers tilted at a specific angle will create the apparition. Next time you're on the ride, look for that glass directly in front of you rather than looking down at the floor. And while you're looking at the glass, you might also find probably the very best secret of the Haunted Mansion, at least our favorite one. Near the end of the Grand Hall, if you're looking up at the glass, you might see what looks like a very large spider on the glass. And while it is a spider, its purpose is really cool. The spider's purpose is actually there to obscure some shattered glass. A long while back, somebody had the great idea to bring a gun of some kind on the ride. It wasn't a high caliber one, of course, but something closer to an air rifle maybe, or a BB gun or something like that. Anyway, he shot the glass that left a spider web-like fracture on it. The cost to repair or replace the glass was enormous, not to mention that it would have been very difficult as the glass is actually one giant piece that stretches the entire width of the hall. They would have had to drop it in from the top, which would require moving the ceiling. So instead of replacing it, they simply put the fake spider over the web-like fracture and voila, you've got a $1.99 fix for $1 million problem. When looking up, there's practically no light at all for the camera, so it's kind of hard to show you where to find the spider, but if you want to see it, just keep looking straight ahead at the glass, not down on the dining room. The organ at the end of the Grand Hall is the actual organ played by Captain Nemo in the Disney film 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. Heading into the attic, this is where the story resumes a more darker tone. And this is where, in the original story, the bride found out the secret of her husband's true identity. It's also where we see the most significant change in recent times to the bride's original story. And while there's always been a bride in the attic, the bride found today has been there since just 2006. And in 2006, she was given a name, Constance, some really creepy dialogue, and that axe. The effects used for the bride is similar to the ones that they used for Leota. This bride appears to depart from the original bride's story of being killed by her husband by being pushed out of the attic window. Now they've got her some kind of black widow. She's less a victim and more a villain. She holds that axe, and there are several paintings in the attic of her with various men, all of whom have their heads gone, presumably because she cut them off. I did. Let's talk about the hatbox ghost. Here's a guy who you can still buy merchandise for today, but he hasn't been seen on the ride by a single paying guest. The hatbox ghost was meant to appear alongside the bride in the attic on the opposite side of the track. He's legend for two reasons. One, because he looks really, really cool. Seriously, he is totally awesome. And two, because in spite of how cool an idea was, it lasted on ride for about 2 whole days. This is because it just didn't work. The effect was supposed to be one where the ghost's head would disappear with each beat of the bride's heart and then reappear in the hatbox. The problem was that there was too much light in the attic and the doom buggies were too close to the character. Guests could see the head in the box when they weren't supposed to. So they took the hatbox ghost out of the attic and he was never seen again. And yet people have not stopped talking about him either. It's really kind of amazing. The caretaker here and his dog are the only real living characters in the entire attraction, except of course for the part where they're actually animatronic. Now's a good time to mention that though Raleigh Crump and Claude Coates are credited with creating the effects and scenes shown in the Haunted Mansion, the story of the Haunted Mansion is credited to ex Atencio. Atencio also wrote the story and title song for Pirates of the Caribbean. When writing the final script for the attraction, it was decided after many years to take the story all the way back to the sign created by Marty Sklar. The Haunted Mansion has in fact become a rest home for ghosts. This is supported by a wide variety of spirits, including an English gentleman drinking tea, these 2 opera singers, and an Egyptian mummy, that kind of thing. Speaking of the opera singer, the female soprano voice is done by Luli G. Norman, and she is also responsible for the vocals in the Star Trek theme. The song, Grim Grinning Ghosts, also written by X Atencio, goes towards setting the tone of the ghosts as being friendly spirits who are just looking to hang out. The song is written so that there's no definite beginning or end, so that it can run in a constant loop without the feeling that you've missed the beginning. Throughout the entire attraction, the music you hear is some version of Grim Grinning Ghosts. The only exception is the bridal march that you hear in the attic. There's an urban legend that says that one of the singing busts is Walt Disney. This is not true, of course. The faces are those of the actual singers of the song. Thurl Ravenscroft, second from the left, is the most famous of the group. He's the original voice of Tony the Tiger and sang the title song, "You're a Mean One, Mr. Grinch." He's also the voice of Fritz the German parrot in the Tiki Room. Each singing bust has a character name. From left to right, they're Ned Nub, Uncle Theodore, Rollo Rumpkin, Phineas Puck, and Cousin Al. The hitchhiking ghosts are also nicknamed. The short-bearded ghost is Gus, the tallest ghost is Ezra, and the ghost in the top hat is Phineas. Also. As you finally leave the attraction and make your way out, you'll see a doll-like bride on your left. This bride is performed by Leota Toombs, as in Madame Leota from the seance scene. The character is thus often referred to as Little Leota, though they are not the same character. And as we finally see the light of day, that wraps up our complete histories and secrets of the Haunted Mansion. Thanks for watching, guys, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel. And until next time, fresh baked!